Welcome everyone to the Edith Wheeler Memorial Library. This is the first installment of Arthur Gottlieb's James Monroe, A Historical Perspective. I would like to take a moment and thank our co-sponsor for this program, the Monroe Historical Society. Now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Arthur Gottlieb.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Thanks for joining me today. I don't get to see myself much on Zoom anymore. I'm back in person most places. So we were just talking about that this morning in my last presentation in Westport. I'm seeing myself in the Zoom camera again for the first time. I look a little kind of pale and washed out. Maybe that's just normal. So we have, as we put it, James Monroe, Historical Perspective, which is something that you'll notice is part of the name that I tag onto all of these things, a historical perspective, because every history thing that we do, well, we've had, in this case, a couple of hundred years of hindsight. And what does the history that we're going to be talking about, what does it mean? And what is the interpretation that people have of historical events in the year 2023? So I had given the Town of Monroe, the library, a number of things that we could potentially talk about. And they said, well, how about this, Art? We're doing this commemorative thing on James Monroe, the namesake of our town. Would you put together a historical presentation for us, which is where we are. And so here is what I wrote in the introduction that was on the list that I sent out. In commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the Town of Monroe's founding, this program will explore the times, events, and legacy of the town's namesake, James Monroe. The fifth president of the United States, serving from 1817 to 1825, Monroe was the last American president to have fought in the Revolutionary War. Serving as president during a period of rapid domestic and international change, Monroe's administration bridged the transition from post-colonial times into a period of continental expansionism that fueled the moral, economic, and political tensions leading directly to the American Civil War. So what I love about this is that it covers a little slice of history that a lot of people don't know much about unless you happen to be specifically interested in this period of time for some reason. From a naval aspect of it, I'm happy because I'm going to be able to bring in the War of 1812 here, which is something that's a fascinating subject just by itself. When we did our Revolutionary War series, I was able to introduce the topic of the French and Indian War, which was, I think, beneficial because a lot of people really didn't know much about it or the effect that it had on continental history, this continent, and also international history as well. And another fascinating part about our story that we're going to be telling over the next few weeks is the politics of the day, which we have a tendency to look at from our perspective today. If you're immersed in politics, current politics, we think that, Monroe's time was so far away, and it was so far away, but yet the similarities are so striking to the politics that we actually have on the table that drive events even to this moment, right? And I always, from a sociological standpoint and from the standpoint of political science, I love to review those things, and we'll be doing that also. So I roughly broke this down into several subcategories, right? We have 5 sessions. So I've got, obviously, today was the introduction where I'm going to be doing an overview of everything. And then we have the next section is James Monroe and the Revolutionary Era, which I am going to include in that also the War of 1812, right? And then the third section will be James Monroe's first presidential term from 1817 to 1821. And the following session on May 3rd, James Monroe's second presidential term, 1821 to 1825, right? And then the last one to bookend today's presentation, I'm going to be talking about James Monroe's legacy and contemporary considerations. All right. Now, there's a lot of contemporary considerations regarding James Monroe. Now, if you look in, if you look under videos or something, I mean, I went on Amazon Prime and, and I typed in James Monroe, and there's really James Monroe in the context of other topics. James Monroe because he had something to do with Thomas Jefferson, or he had something to do with James Madison, or he had something to do with Andrew Jackson, or he had something to do with George Washington. But there's no real program on James Monroe just like at your fingertips. You can go and get it. Yes, it's true. And there are books written about it. You can get that too. My point is that James Monroe kind of falls into a kind of a gray area because he's bookended by people who were more famous than he is. Okay. And you'll have other portions of presidential history, American presidential history, where that is true as well. Now, despite that, there's a lot of stuff named after James Monroe, right? Exhibit A, Monroe. So I have some handwritten notes that's going to guide me along today. So forgive me for just darting my eyes over as I go through these things. Now, I assume that a number of you are from the town of Monroe, not necessarily all of you. So I wonder what kind of personal interest you have. I know there's a Monroe Historical Society, and they, of course, must have a tranche of information on some of the nuances of Mr. Monroe as well. And that would certainly be a reference. Let's look at some of the highlights of James Monroe's life. Okay, just some of the highlights to give you an example of some of the framework of what I'm going to be talking about. Born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, and that is in April 28th, 1758. And right over there, we have just a whole story by itself, because there is this list of American early presidents during the early part of our nation's history, and it was called the Virginia Dynasty, if you will, and it has other names. Monroe is usually referred to, I guess, playfully as the last cocked hat. And what that means is that he's the last, American president who came from Virginia as a Virginia gentleman, and he dressed like, George Washington. He dressed like Jefferson. Right after that, now we have we're into the 1800s, and much later on, it was kind of like the uniform of public speaking and being a diplomat changed after that, right? People aren't walking around with leggings with their knickers tied around their lower knee, and all the rest of that after this point. Gone were the powdered wigs and things. And it reminds me of how Kennedy rocked the world by not wearing a hat at his inauguration. It seems like a frivolous thing, but it actually turned out to be. It's an interesting milestone of social, direction and social mores. There's a long line of people who came from Virginia who were American presidents. And this is something that's going to mark a difference in a long-standing American tradition. Whereas, where does the president come from? Is he from the East, right? So in our own century, you know, you had people who hearkened from the East, a lot of times from the Northeast, from the Mideast, or the mid-Atlantic states, I should say, like President Wilson, President Roosevelt, right? And he was marked, those two, and just to name two, not to mention John F. Kennedy, you know, these were sort of elite Eastern people. And then you had other folks who came from, I don't know, the Midwest or the Ohio Valley, who seemed different in culture almost to the polished and refined East Coast people, right? We have that even back in these days over here. Remember, it was a very class-conscious society going back to the early days of our country, and I might argue to some extent now. We like to think of ourselves past all of that, but really, you know, from a sociological standpoint, which is always an analysis you're getting from me, I mean, it's very, very important. Now, while James Monroe was a part of a polished background from Virginia, he was a lot different than the, say, for instance, the Jeffersons. Like Thomas Jefferson was an intellectual. He was a scholar. Thomas Jefferson was interested in why the universe was the way it was. See, James Monroe wasn't really interested in knowing why the universe was the way it was. Right? James Monroe was a pragmatic person who got through his political career being a politician, and he was a competent person who was known for his administrative competency, you see. And he's a marked difference than other people, like, of course, I'm using the example of Jefferson, who were, you know, more of an inspired personality and these deep philosophical thinkers rooted in Enlightenment thought. You know, so we need to understand who James Monroe is. To a large extent, he's just like he's like a normal person compared to the Thomas Jeffersons of the world, you know. Yet at the same time, he's the last one who's considered the last person from the original group of the founding fathers, if you will, right? So he's the last person who served as the president who actually fought in the Revolutionary War. Right, so this is a crucial period of time, fascinating. I jumped at the opportunity to do this because it's an opportunity for me to share with you things that normally don't get talked about. But to be able to understand James Monroe, it needs to be completely put in context with what became before James Monroe, during, obviously, and then after, as a result of his presidency. And that's what we're going to be doing during our presentation. His house, by the way, in Virginia, you can see Thomas Jefferson's house, right? Monticello. You could see it from where James Monroe was. And also, interestingly, by the way, James Monroe spent the last years of his life, I wouldn't call it in poverty, I would call it in debt, deeply in debt. All right. And you know what? So did Thomas Jefferson. So did Thomas Jefferson couldn't pay his bills. And the creditors were after Thomas Jefferson, and they were going to foreclose on Monticello and throw Jefferson out. The only reason they didn't do it was because nobody wanted to be the one to throw Jefferson out. And after Jefferson died, Monticello actually was an abandoned piece of property, right? It just sat there in disrepair. And it was bought by a family, interestingly enough, a Jewish family, who actually put the thing back together to restore it for its, you know, it's the significance of it being Thomas Jefferson's home. So as I mentioned earlier, 1776 to 1780, James Monroe fights in the Revolutionary War, right? So this is important from the standpoint of what it makes a person a person. I mean, would you have a different idea of what the meaning of America was All right, if I was to grab somebody off the street right now and say, well, what is the meaning of America and why is it a big deal? And does it matter if we're America or if we just become part of Canada or God knows what? See, I don't know what kind of an answer I would get. But if I was going to ask James Monroe, he would have a different answer because obviously he was there at the founding. He fought for American Revolution, right? He fought for American Revolution. So therefore, where was James Monroe? He couldn't wait to fight, right? This was something that he had to get in on, and he believed strongly in American independence from Great Britain, right? So that tells us something right there. I mean, because remember, you had a lot of people around who didn't feel that way. They felt as though we should just stay with Great Britain and, the rest of you rebellious colonists are crazy, right? So that tells us a lot about this man right off the bat, right? And it tells us that he has an investment in what it was that shall we say, the American experiment in the Revolutionary War and then becoming a country was all about. And that tells us a lot about James Monroe and his attitudes and his points of view when he was in a position of governorship and then, of course, the presidency. And not only that, not only did he fight in the Revolutionary War, he literally fought alongside George Washington, right? Which is not something that everybody gets to say. And Monroe was there in the fateful winter of 1776 at Valley Forge. And that's like saying that you were in, I don't know, that you were at Pearl Harbor during December 7th, 1941, or that you fought in the Battle of the Bulge or something. I mean, it's not just another day, And next to him at Valley Forge was James Monroe's lifetime friend, childhood friend, a person named John Marshall, who was to become a Supreme Court Justice of the United States, right? And they were all there freezing and their teeth chattering at Valley Forge. James Monroe was one of the people who crossed the Delaware to fight, in these battles that were very, very significant and turned the Revolutionary War around in favor of the Americans. Not that we were literally, chasing the British back into the sea, but it was enough to turn the tide of French opinion to give the French the ability to say, we're going to throw our hat in the ring with the Americans here. And that changed not just the fortunes of the American Revolution in favor of the colonists, but it changed the history of the world. I don't think I'm overstating it in that regard. 1782, Monroe becomes a member of the Virginia legislature. From 1783 to 1786, Monroe becomes a member of Virginia's delegation to Congress. 1786 to 1790, Monroe becomes a member of the Virginia state legislature. And then from 1790 to 1794, Monroe is now the senator from Virginia, a senator from Virginia. Now, this is very, very important over here as well. In 1794 to 1796, Monroe becomes the United States minister to France. And that is always a big deal. Because remember, France back in those days was the competing power to Great Britain. You see, remember, the United States is just like this new wet behind the ears country. And then going to France or Great Britain was like, coming from a third world country practically over to the United States, where at its zenith of power, world power. And then you had to kind of choose sides between who you were in favor of. Were you leaning towards the French or were you leaning towards the British? You know, you couldn't do both because they were at war forever, right? And if you, I want you to think about this James Monroe and the French thing in context of something that might be more familiar. It was Thomas Jefferson was in France for a long time, right? And it had a tremendous effect on him, and it had a tremendous effect on the French, as it had to do with the character of what was considered now a new culture, the Americans, right? And so this business of being over France, and this wasn't just like a trip, you know. I mean, today, if I had a meeting with somebody in France, I'd be probably doing it on a Zoom meeting right now, right? But back in these days, you had to like go. You had to get on a ship. It took you God knows how long to get over there, and then you stayed for a while, and you soaked in the culture, and you couldn't help but be either favorable to the French or not. And if you were favorable to the French, it means that you were less favorable to Great Britain, right? Now, this is very, very important, right? Because this is before the War of 1812, which obviously, as you know, was between the United States and Great Britain, you see? So what I'm telling you is that you got to look at your natural bias towards these things and put yourself in this position, you know? So Monroe always favored the French. And I think that's an important thing to understand. And when we're doing an analysis of Monroe, we have to put ourselves into his position of what his biases were as well. Where was I? So he becomes the governor of Virginia, 1899 to 1802, right? The governor of Virginia. And that's a pretty big deal. 1803, here's a big one. He is a prime person who is involved in negotiation of purchasing Louisiana, right? And when I mean Louisiana, Louisiana meant French territory that was included, yeah, that's right, in Louisiana, right? So how about this? This is the first time a United States government, I mean, well, any government, doubled the size of its country, right? No war, no conquest, none of those things. We bought it. Some whopping amount of money. I don't know, so 20, I forgot how many millions of dollars it was, you know, but it was like exceeded the gross national budget. But we doubled the landmass of the country, the United States of America, by this one thing, the Louisiana Purchase. I mean, it is probably, I'm having trouble finding words to describe how significant this was in not only American history, but world history. Remember, back before this, before the Louisiana Purchase, the United States, the North American landmass, okay, where the United States as we know it now is, right? I mean, there was still like a whole bunch of competing forces there. You know, you had the Spanish, you had the French, right? We had pretty much driven the British out towards like Canada, you know, and but we had the Russians, you know, the Russians were contesting lands that were up in Oregon and etc. And after the Louisiana Purchase, the United States actually had like a bulk of this landmass, right? That went like from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Rockies. It's incredible. And James Monroe was a large part of that negotiation. And I think that no small measure of his successfulness is during that time that he spent in France. See? And then 1803 to 1807, James Monroe is the United States minister to Great Britain. See, so look at the foreign policy experience this guy is getting. It's just incredible, really, right? And U.S. minister to Great Britain. 1811, once again, the governor of Virginia. 1811 to 1817, it's the Secretary of State under Madison. Now, during this period of time, there's this little party going on called the War of 1812, right? And I'm going to be talking about that in further detail, during our next lecture. But the War of 1812 was actually an extraordinarily significant conflict. It's usually something that, just gets rolled over, in between, lost between the Revolution and the Civil War. But the War of 1812 was very, very, very significant. The kind of fighting, the United States was actually trying to grab Canada, right? Did you know that? And we kept trying. We were trying to wrestle Canada away from the British. And the kind of joke about this is who won the War of 1812, right? Now, of course, the warring parties of the War of 1812 were the British and the United States. But the joke is that who won the War of 1812 was the Canadians. Okay, because the Canadians they actually dug into their own sovereignty as a result of the War of 1812. And there was a number of other things going on there too. The need for a United States Navy. It also brought to fame a character we're going to be hearing more about, right? And that is one Andrew Jackson, okay, who wins the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812, after the war has actually been negotiated to a close, right? So he actually fights this battle after the war is over, but it's not like it's not like he didn't get the tweet, the information was running a lot slower and in different fashions back in those times. But it creates a national hero and this mythos in this, I don't think that he would mind if I called him a character, Andrew Jackson, this very populist, very nationalist, very American character named Andrew Jackson, who, like David and Goliath, is able to defeat the overwhelming British. That was the Treaty of Ghent that ended the War of 1812. Not that I thought that was important to tell you, it's just more like I'm proud that I remembered that and I wanted to share it with you. So the Treaty of Ghent. Okay, 1811, United States Secretary of State under President Madison. 1814 to 1815, United States Secretary of War under President Madison. You see, so he did these two things simultaneously. He held two cabinet positions, James Monroe, simultaneously for the previous administration, the Madison administration. And this is what gives James Monroe the reputation of being a competent manager and administrator. You see, so the guy, like I said, he's not an idealist. He's not up there, talking about things and the arc of history and, other sorts of inspiring, phraseology that's reminiscent of the Bible or philosophy. I mean, he's just a good administrator. You see, it's another president that we had that was similar in that one regard, who is often overlooked and overshadowed, is Herbert Hoover, right? Herbert Hoover was he was an engineer, And he was very, very good at organizing things and handling, stuff that was dropping in his inbox and international affairs. And he just did it quietly behind the scenes. He wasn't an idealist. He wasn't an ideologue, right? He just got the job done, right? And James Monroe was somebody who just got the job done, right? And from that standpoint, the guy he didn't rise to a position of power from fame or from inspiring people. James Monroe rose to the position of the presidency because he was a politician. He was a career politician who was a competent person, and he rose from being a career politician, just being good at what he did. That was it. So 1817 to 1825, James Monroe becomes the 5th president of the United States. Question just popped up. So the two positions that Monroe served, you had the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War under Madison. So then, as I said, 1817 to 1825, James Monroe is now the 5th president of the United States, the 5th president. What are we on, 46 now, right? And in 1829, later on, co-chair of the Virginia State Constitutional Convention, and Monroe dies on July 4th, 1831, age 73, in New York City. And there we have it. That's the life expanse of James Monroe. And of course, the fascinating thing that we're going to go through during our program is literally how the world changed, how the United States changed, how the Americas changed, and how the world changed during this period of time. It's really quite remarkable. And we think about things from the standpoint of the current news cycle, right? This is my second today of 3 presentations I'm doing, right? And the third one after this is going to be on focus on contemporary issues, right? Which is, kind of like an intelligent way, I hope an intelligent way of saying current events, right? So we're going to be talking about, like, obviously some of the stuff that's in the news cycle about current events, and we tend to think about politics as, and things going on with Russia and Ukraine and these geopolitical forces and the alliances with China now and Iran, and of course our own domestic politics between Democrats and Republicans, or conservatives and progressives, if you will. All of that stuff is replete right here in the story of James Monroe. Everything I just mentioned in its own, 1820 version. And what I like about history like this is that it really puts what's going on in our current framework in kind of like a context, because many people think as though what I would describe maybe as the tumult or the unrest or the, just the kind of the grind of our own politics somehow seems like an anomaly, and geez, there must have been a time where everybody just got along, which means that right now, particularly, we don't get along. So that means that there's some kind of a problem that needs to be corrected. And you can see by studying, certainly, our own history, our own American history, since our founding, that maybe we didn't have the internet, and we didn't have Twitter, and we didn't have, all of these blogs all over the place, and cable TV, and the 24/7 news cycle, and all of these talking heads who constantly have to find something exciting or dramatic to talk about. Nothing's really changed. It's really very, very fascinating. So let's go through this. I've got some pages of handwritten notes here. Once again, please bear with me while looking down. So as I said earlier, James Monroe, notably, is the last of what was referred to as the Virginia dynasty, right? I mentioned that just a moment ago. So, when you have these folks who look like the people who were signing the Constitution, the way they were dressed and their mannerisms and that like kind of generation, if you will. I mean, James Monroe is the last one. He's the last one, and we're kind of into a new era after that. Now, during the Revolution, as I said to you, he fought under George Washington at Valley Forge, right? And we'll do that in more detail later. You know that there was this rumor that James Monroe was depicted in that boat, that famous painting. I forget the name of the artist. You know the painting I'm talking about, where Washington's going headed across the Delaware, and supposedly James Monroe is in the back holding some flag. It's not him. So it's just another little historical tidbit. It's not him. Although I love that painting. It's a great painting if you've never seen it. So after the Revolutionary War, James Monroe became an aide to Thomas Jefferson, right? And then, as I mentioned to you in my bullet point list, then the governor of Virginia. Now, what do you think it would be like to be an aide to Thomas Jefferson? Right? Have you ever apprenticed next to somebody? Right? Or, had some kind of an influence from somebody that you looked up to or that you were attached to, professionally. Can you imagine being attached to Thomas Jefferson? Think about the effect that must have had on a younger James Monroe, from an aspirational standpoint. Now, this is very, very important. And this is something else we're going to be talking about, and that I want to get across to my audience today, is that one of the largest things in American history is to understand our original history, like we're talking about today, but also to put our contemporary issues in context, was something called Jeffersonianism versus Hamiltonianism. Okay, and you can't really understand American politics without understanding this. And so the kind of division that we have, I mean, to use a wild example of extreme examples, take the 2020 election, if you will, and what one side is supposedly represented versus what the other side is supposedly represented, right? And, that's just one example. There are many. That was already alive and well and kicking during the presidency of George Washington, right? Which I don't have to remind you was the first president, you see? So that's another misnomer that we have about our own contemporary era, where we think that, well, I thought we were all just supposed to get along, and those people over there who have their ideas, whatever they are, whatever side you're talking about, are obviously wrong and they're dangerous for the country. That existed to the same degree then as it does right now. And the only difference that we've had in between, obviously, 200 whatever years, is you've had these relative pockets of quiet. And it turns out that the relative pockets of quiet were the anomalies, you see? Now, the presidency of James Monroe is one of those relative anomalies of quiet. His tenure as a president was kind of nicknamed, what was it? The era of good feelings, I guess. Now that was it, the era of good feelings. There was some reporter or something, you know how these names stick. Well, what was it to me? What does that mean? The era of good feelings, right? Does that mean people don't hate each other? Or it was just the way that this lined up. It's just the way it lined up, where you had the opposing political party to the Jeffersonians. The opposing political party were called the Federalists, right, from New England. And they had kind of lost power and had sort of, as a party, had lost, they were weak, right? So essentially what happened was, what James Monroe was, the party that he belonged to, and the party that Jefferson represented. So Jefferson and Monroe on the same political party now. They were called Democratic Republicans, right? Which today would just be the Republicans. And what happened was the Federalists, who by today's comparison would be the Democrats, they politically became weaker at that moment. So you had this kind of party dominance that James Monroe enjoyed because of the weakness of one of the other parties, you see? And because there wasn't this constant, vitriolic, I'm going to eat your liver, kind of a thing going on from a day-to-day basis, then it seemed like everybody was getting along. And people still strive for that. They're striving for that right now, about trying to essentially just damage the opposite party to a point where the opposite party is in a state of, I don't know what you would call it, remission, weakness, and then if that's the case and one party becomes politically dominant or has more power, things quiet down because more people are on one side unanimously without the fight. And that was the period of time that James Monroe was president. That situation occurred, right? Now, one of the quietest times I can remember in my own memory, is I remember, let me say, Bill Clinton, right? I mean, things seemed relatively peaceful during Bill Clinton's time. And, for me as a young person, I mean, it was like, woohoo, the Cold War is over because the Soviet Union had fallen apart in, what was it, 1991. And we had this thing called the peace dividend, because it's like, geez, what do we need this incredible, intercontinental ballistic missile apparatus for, and all the rest of those things that go along with it, and everything else like that. Geez, there's nobody left to fight, right? And so we that, and having excess money now that could be put into different things, and some of the lack of anxiety that had existed for people like me all my life, and for people older than me probably all of their lives, about, we're going to wake up being blown to bits, right? Remember that? And that was gone. And that was a relief. And also it was simultaneous in the early 1990s of the computer revolution, who, if you were a young person like me, was like really interested in all of that, and this crazy thing called the internet, with my dial-up modem, right? And all the rest of that. You see what I mean? So it was this period of almost good feelings, if you will, right? And it was not exactly like that, but I tried to give you a similar analogy, that you have these little pockets of time, And James Monroe, he presided over a time like, number one, like I said to you, his opposing party, right, the Federalists, right, who hated the Democratic Republicans, happened to be in a position of descendancy, so he didn't have to deal with it. He wasn't getting eviscerated politically and in the editorial commentary of the day. The War of 1812 was over, right? So there was that I don't want to call it a peace dividend, but I don't want to not call it a peace dividend either. And it was in between the War of 1812, and it was just before the proverbial stuff hit the fan with the direct run-up of the American Civil War. So it was like this sweet spot, if you will. That is, I think, overall for me, one of the most notable things that marked the Monroe presidency. You know, in context, the position of time that it lived in. All right. Monroe had a close friendship, a friendly rivalry with with Madison. You know, another thing with Madison, right? I mean, James Monroe had a wife, but she was considered an outcast in Washington because she was, I don't know, she didn't want to hang around and do things, and she didn't want to be the belle of the ball, so to speak. Now, what kind of fallout would a first lady have like that? I mean, why would she have it? Right? Because what was the predecessor president's wife? You see how this works? Who was it? Dolly Madison. Yeah, the ice cream Dolly Madison. That's her. Right? And Dolly Madison was a hard act to follow. You know, Dolly Madison had these huge parties. She invited everybody, you know, and before the age of refrigeration, she served this incredible delicacy in this very Maria Antoinette-esque way, because the commoners couldn't have it because they didn't have refrigeration. I mean, the White House didn't have refrigeration either, but they had ice. What was it? Ice cream. That's what she was famous for. Not just ice cream, but strawberry ice cream. You want to talk about a delicacy. I mean, people were tripping over themselves to go to one of Dolly Madison's events because they had ice cream. It was like serving lobster, you know, except it was better than lobster. And so the Monroe administration fell into this dark spot because of stupid stuff like this. You see what I mean? Because look at it this way. Take Mamie Eisenhower, right? Do you remember Mamie Eisenhower, or do you remember Eleanor Roosevelt better? You see what I mean? Do you remember Lady Bird Johnson, or do you remember Jacqueline Kennedy? That's what we got here. You see, and that's just the way it works. It's just the way it works. These things get compared to the thing that happened before it. And, you know, so the Monroe administration was seemingly like, you know, so what? Boring. But it was, Dolly Madison was a hard act to follow, right? That's good. I get to talk about ice cream too. Monroe, right? Like I said to you, he wasn't a scholar. He wasn't a political philosopher. And I also mentioned that he was just a competent career politician, right? Now, importantly, going back to this Jefferson versus Hamilton thing, right? This is probably, if you wanted to understand what come away from these lecture series with a better understanding of American politics, it doesn't get any bigger than this. Hamilton versus Jefferson, right? So our guy here, James Monroe, was a Jeffersonian. And what does it mean to be a Jeffersonian versus what it means to be a Hamiltonian, right? Now we've got this famous, you know, play down in New York City, right? And it's, you know, it is a dramatization artistically of Hamilton, right? But Hamilton is very, is easier put to political correctness and to feel goodness, overlapped with our own contemporary politics, because the Hamilton versus Jefferson thing is really the precursor to what we have today. The roughly put, right? The people up in New England, right, were the Hamiltonians, okay? Remember, the country was a lot smaller back then, certainly before the Louisiana Purchase, okay? So, and the Hamiltonians, and Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, right? And Hamilton felt as though, I'm going to try and find a way to simplify this, but not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Hamilton felt as though the federal government should be expansive and larger and have the ability to have power to make people's lives better, okay? And therefore, it needed money to do so. It needed to be in a position where it could create, laws and rules and these different things that were going to branch out into people's lives more or less on a daily basis. And not only that, but it was going to create a national bank. And, and that was going to be a situation where like the Treasury could fund things. And people back in those days, and we're talking about Washington's administration, George Washington. And there were people who were the Republicans, right? The Democratic Republicans, who were saying that is not why we fought the Revolutionary War. We fought the Revolutionary War to get away from a centralized, authoritative government. I mean, if we're going to create a federal government that's going to wind up telling us what to do and what they're going to be spending our money on that we don't agree with and limiting our freedom, then what was the point of breaking away from Great Britain, right? And so literally you had the Republicans under Jefferson, where you had this kind of, I guess it would be fair to say, this idealized rural living, and to be an American meant that you were, what was the term I'm looking for? Self-reliance. Self-reliant. I'm not going to bother you. You're not going to bother me. I'm not going to ask you for anything. Don't ask me for anything, right? Right. I have what we have fought in the revolution for, which is my liberty. My liberty to believe what I want and to do what I want, unfettered by some oppressive, overreaching, power-hungry central government, right? That's what Jeffersonianism was. And I'm out here on the frontier and I'm growing my food, I'm eating my food, I go to work every day, and I have the satisfaction of knowing that I'm doing God's work, okay? And I'm feeding my family, right? Now, the Hamiltonians were more cosmopolitan, more urbane, more intellectual, okay? And you can see how these two rough categories, right? And, the intellectual people, the Hamiltonians, of course, were, because they were dealing with their brains and they were dealing with what we would today call science, right? They were condescending to the other people who were just the old-fashioned people with their old-fashioned values. So you see how this actually builds the framework for literally what were the heirs of, like, right to this moment. And two of the most consequential undercurrents in literally every single breath we take here in America at this moment, you see. And this is literally, this whole thing is alive and well. And Washington didn't want to get rid of either one of these guys because they were creating this big tension in his administration. Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, right? I mean, Washington did his best to assuage both of them and said, listen, you're both brilliant. I love you both, right? I don't know if he said that, but he is saying, I'm going to try and find a way where we can find some common ground here. But the two sides that were represented between Jefferson and Hamilton is literally our original, the genesis of the two tracts of American thought that is alive and well right to this moment. And both sides are trying to eventually, diminish the other, right? Because one side literally thinks that the other side is not only anti-American, but is a danger to America, right? I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric that we've had over the last few years, certainly. And literally, this is exactly the same type of rhetoric that was going on back in the first administration of the United States. I mean, Hamilton and Jefferson tried to kill each other. And I mean, each one of them had newspapers and press that was favorable to each of them. And they did their best to literally, it was like, whatever, CNN and Fox News or something. I mean, I know that I'm throwing a couple of things out there. It's not completely fair to either of those outlets, but I just wanted to use an example, where it's kind of like, this is my guy and this is what we believe in. This is what our values are. And therefore the other side's, we're going to look at this more favorably and that side disfavorably. And then you go to the other outlet and it's going to be literally the opposite, right? And both sides is trying to humiliate the other side and create a dramatic public impression, to create a narrative about the other side, that they're dangerous to be in power, right? And create that image in the American mind. I mean, that was alive and well, and we had already hammered out the details about how to politically destroy somebody back in Jefferson and Hamilton's day. And the only thing that's changed between then and now is the technology. And so anyway, so you've got James Monroe. See, so that's why I'm telling you the story, right? Because James Monroe is in the shadow and obviously aligned with Jefferson. So automatically, based on everything we've just talked about, or what I've talked about, is going to be, you can see that Monroe has a certain way of looking at the Constitution, a certain way of looking at American values, a certain way of looking what the United States should be and what it shouldn't be, its involvement not only domestically, but with foreign adversaries and friends alike, and what the United States should be, just from what I said. So that is probably the biggest thing that we're going to talk about that's going to have an effect on our understanding of James Monroe. And so it's essentially the Jeffersonians, as an extension of what I just said, had the feeling that the Constitution was a document that was there not to empower a federal government, that the Constitution was there to do the opposite, right? The Jeffersonians felt that the Constitution was a document designed to limit the power of the federal government. Limit the power of the federal government so that, number one, the states can remain sovereign and independent from the federal government, and number two, that the individual could remain independent and sovereign to not only the state government but the federal government, right? The Hamiltonians were the opposite. The Hamiltonians were like, we're from the government, we're here to help you, you see? And the two of them are literally incompatible. They're incompatible then, and I would argue they're incompatible now, right? And everything's been kind of like this clunky sort of compromise in between. You with me? We have 10th Amendment state right issues today all over the place. And this was to become first and foremost during during Monroe's administration, because this whole issue of, whether or not states are going to be allowed to be entered into the Union as a slave state or a free state, I mean, literally hinged on whether the federal government had the right to tell a state what it could and couldn't do if it wasn't enumerated in the Constitution about being a responsibility of the federal government, right? So if the Constitution is a limiting government document, is a document designed to limit the reach of the federal government, which Monroe felt it was, then the federal government needed to take a hands-off approach to whatever thought about whatever states were doing that the federal government didn't agree with. You see the difference here? It's a big deal. It's a big deal. And this is what the Civil War was fought over, I mean, we think of it in terms of, well, slavery versus not, or we're trying to emancipate the slaves, etc. But it was as far as the South was concerned, it was a question of states' rights, the 10th Amendment, which is exactly what we're talking about here. Another thing that's important to use phrases that we use today is that Monroe was something we would refer to today as a constitutional originalist. Well, what is that? And these things are worthwhile telling the stories because we'll understand more about our own, the stuff that's dropping right in front of us right now and has been dropping in front of us. So once again, we see this kind of, drama when there's, you're going in front of Congress to, for the advice and consent of a federal judge, right? So in other words, so what do you want to see in a judge? You see? So if you're somebody from the Hamiltonian school of thought, which let's say are Democrats today, you will want somebody who's going to take an interpretation of the power of the federal government to be more expansive. You see, that it is the natural duty of the federal government to create, to enact, and to interpret laws where the federal government is allowed to have the maximum reach into people's lives because, well, I mean, the federal government is there to help you see? And the way to look at that would be to say that, well, it's constitutional and it's American because unless the federal government is there to protect you from either yourself or some other nefarious force, then you will not be able to pursue your liberty, as the Declaration states. You see, so because the Declaration of Independence states that you are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that if certain conditions exist where we, the government, say that you are unable to pursue that happiness, then the federal government literally needs to step in and correct the world until you can. You see, and that's why the federal government is allowed to have this, kind of like this expansive notion, right? That would be like a Hamiltonian way to look at it, you see? Now, if you're somebody who's a conservative today, you would say, well, no, I want a Supreme Court justice or somebody on the federal bench who's going to take a more restrictive view of the Constitution, right? In other words, a conservative meaning from the standpoint of conservation. And when the term conservation would mean in conservative, what are we conserving? You're conserving something called the original intent of the Constitution, right? So in other words, we're not adding to it, we're not multiplying it, we're not empowering the federal government as a secondary thing. That would be somebody you might call an originalist, right? An originalist is somebody who is looking at the Constitution and they're saying, well, this is what the Constitution says. And I'm sorry, what you brought before us is unconstitutional, because either the Constitution, A, doesn't address it directly, or B, the Constitution doesn't give the federal government the authority to go there. It's just that simple. You see, somebody who would be a Hamiltonian, right, would say, oh, well, no, that's not enough. You've got to be able to look at what the wording or the text is of the Constitution, and then apply it in the context of whatever the social mores of the day are, et cetera. And so that we get to interpret whether or not something's really constitutional, not by what it says, which is what an originalist would do, but by what we ought to do. Right? That is the difference. That's the difference. And it's still the difference. The exact same difference, right? Monroe, to understand Monroe and what Monroe did in a number of cases, you have to understand that because in the Jeffersonian tradition, he is a constitutional originalist, right? He believes in the limited size of the federal government. Anything that isn't enumerated as a responsibility of the federal government is outlined in the Constitution, which is the purpose of the Constitution, was hands off from the federal government. And the Constitution was a document designed to empower states and individuals and to limit the power of the federal government, right? A Hamiltonian would see it opposite than that, right? So you see it, so it's fascinating. Right back from the time of Washington, we had already wound up essentially creating a two-party system, you see, unwittingly, because nobody wanted a party system. But that's what, I don't know, that it's what it morphed into, kind of like in this natural sort of way of just, you know, having these two big differences of opinion about the power of the federal government and how to interpret the limitations thereof. So, for instance, it was in front of Monroe to whether or not the United States should create and pay for a series, an entire network of roads and canals that would have connected the industrialized East to the frontier, right? Which would have cost, you know, whatever, a gazillion dollars, right? And I mean, who could argue the commercial viability of such a thing? I mean, this would be, wouldn't this bolster the economy and everything else? It'd be like what we would call today stimulus, I guess, right? And I mean, and nobody is knocking the idea that we couldn't use something like that, or that wouldn't have been beneficial, even in the terms of, you know, pre-motorized transportation. But Monroe, he vetoed it. Congress passed it, and Monroe vetoed this thing because he felt strongly that the United States Constitution did not specify any such authority for the federal government to spend this kind of money on something like that. It just, show me in the Constitution where it says that we're supposed to be doing this, right? So it was passed by Congress, and he literally vetoed it because he was like, this is what would it be called today? An excess of congressional whatever appropriations, you see. And that was Monroe, and it tells us a lot about him and why he has that viewpoint. See, the first president that we ever had who actually had a different viewpoint about, you know, but the federal government should cut money loose, right, for the so-called, I don't know, what should we call it, the good and welfare, was Theodore Roosevelt, right? Now, Theodore Roosevelt, he was, you know, he wasn't what I would refer to as a liberal from today's standpoint, but he was a progressive, but he was a conservative, right? He was like a conservative nationalist. But what he was progressive about, Teddy Roosevelt, was the notion that the federal government should cut money loose, a lot of money, for what? National parks. You see? National parks, right? So Teddy Roosevelt, I mean, I don't know if anybody would knock Teddy Roosevelt today for setting aside all of those land masses that we could now enjoy as, you know, those thousands upon thousands of acres of preserved land. Yet at the same time, Teddy Roosevelt stepped on, it was a 10th Amendment problem, because a lot of the states out west, a vast amount of their area is actually controlled by the federal government. So the state might be, you know, this state number one, but like a third of state number one is actually controlled by the federal government, you see? You know, so there's a 10th Amendment issue there as well. But this is where we come into the beginning of progressivism in this standpoint, where the federal government is going to flex its muscles. And once the federal government decides to do something because of the supremacy clause in the 10th Amendment, the states have to go with it. You know, and that's been a source of tension forever. And I'm not saying it was right or wrong to do. I mean, if you look at, if we did a program on national parks, we can see that, I mean, I don't know, Yosemite wouldn't be Yosemite as we know it, right? I mean, it would be this commercialized Disney World-like place that would have been completely polluted and destroyed, you know? So I'm not one who's going to knock the formation of national parks. I'm just bringing up kind of like a template of ideas that overlap into other things that we can use. You know, and from the standpoint of progressive that we talk about it today, the first person to be that kind of progressive, or in the tradition of a Hamiltonian, would be a descendant of somebody from the Federalist. A true descendant of the Federalists would be a Woodrow Wilson, right? A Woodrow Wilson who, like Teddy Roosevelt, said, all right, well, we've set the precedent that the United States is going to take money and we're going to use it for things that isn't enumerated specifically in the Constitution, you see, for what we're calling the greater good, right? And but they're going to do it on other sorts of things, right? We can do that some other time when we talk about Wilson or something like that. And in the Wilsonian tradition, then you had most famous of all, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? And he would be a direct descendant of what we were talking about also, the Hamiltonians. And then I guess the biggest stop after that would be maybe Lyndon Baines Johnson, and then of course Barack Obama. Okay. So like other Democrat Republicans that came to power during the War of 1812, right? James Monroe was something that we call a nationalist, right? Which is another term that deserves exploration, because we've got terms being thrown around like that constantly today, and for the same argument that it was thrown around when James Madison was around. What does it mean to be a nationalist? Right, today we would use it in the term of nationalist versus a globalist, right? So then, well, what is a globalist, right? A globalist is somebody who would think like, I don't know, as a citizen of the United States, I'm really a citizen of the world that just happens to be here in the United States, right? So therefore, if I was the president in my foreign policy, if I was a globalist, I'd be concerned about, you know, making sure that the United States, whatever we were doing or spending money on or whatever we're interested in, were alignment in with all of the other governments of the world, you see? If I was a nationalist, I would say that, well, the hell with the rest of the world, right? We'll get to that after we've taken care of our own people, you see, and we've protected our own borders, right? That's a nationalist. And heaven knows, I don't think that requires any more definition as far as the divisions that we have right at this moment. You see, and it is literally the exact same thing that Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison were discussing, except back in those days, right? During Monroe's time, you had a situation where the old world was firmly entrenched in the Americas, right? I mean, if you think about the kind of first and second world colonization that was still on our shores back in those days, the United States was just a fledgling nation. I mean, like I said to you before, with the Louisiana Purchase, we still had the French, you still got the Spanish, right? And you have what? The Russians, you've got the British to the north. And, this was a period of time where, people were traditionally in Europe, were like firmly entrenched in here. And not only that, but here before we were here, right? Look how many places in the Americas where people speak Spanish, right? Case in point. And of course, the remnants of French, we have French speaking areas of Louisiana, as well as, of course, defiantly so, people in Quebec, right? So Monroe helped to negotiate the Treaty of Louisiana Purchase. I spoke about that. Now, the Monroe Doctrine, speaking of this business of nationalism, the Monroe Doctrine is probably something that changed the world as much as anything changed the world, right? And this is very, very ballsy stuff, okay? We're a country that's barely been in business for like, I don't know, 50 years, 40 plus years. And we turn around to the established world powers of the day and say, you know what? Why don't you stay over there in Europe and leave us the hell alone over here? No kidding, really. And the United States literally marks itself as a world power in 1820 by telling the European colonial powers that we told them we will abide by the fact that you have already, of course, people are already speaking your language here in this country. But from this point forward, don't come across the ocean and, drop an army over here or expect to politically influence one of the nations in the Americas, not just the United States, but in the Americas. The United States draws a dotted line around the Western Hemisphere and says anything that happens here from this point on is going to be our business. This is our house. You see like when I was a kid, I guess somebody would have called that a lot of chutzpah, I mean, really. And I'm not saying that was the wrong thing to do. I'm not here to take a position like that, but I'm just trying to say to you that for a country that's literally opened its door 50 years ago, compared to countries that have been in business for hundreds of years, right? For us to make that kind of declaration. And by the way, it was a reciprocal thing. We were not going to mess with anybody else's business either, you see? And this is very important to understand, because this is based not in Jeffersonianism. This is based in Washingtonianism, okay? Now, in the farewell address of George Washington, he warned us. It was a prophetic warning. It's kind of like on the terms of stature and remembrance of like Eisenhower's farewell address, where it's kind of like beware of the military industrial complex. Well, that was it, right? And so, Washington gives us one of those at the end of his presidency. And he says to beware of the foreign entanglements, right? He's specifically referring to Europe. And he's saying, basically, right, my summarization, these people have been killing each other over there for thousands of years. They're going to be killing each other for more thousands of years. Now is the time for the United States to enjoy and respect. And of course, George Washington would put it in the form of that God gave us a unique opportunity to create a society in a new world that was going to be bereft of all of the traditional chaos that was going on in Europe and would always be going on in Europe, right? So Monroe inherits this value, if you will, of America. Is today we would call it isolationism, right? Like, why are we fighting that war? Why are we sending our national treasure over there? Is this in our interests? Are we hurting ourselves from doing this? Do you think that's something that's relevant right at this moment? No matter what your feelings are about what we're doing in Ukraine, I'm not taking a position on that. I'm making an argument about how nothing has changed, okay? Nothing has changed. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have fought Hitler or anything else like that. I'm not saying that at all, obviously not, okay? But the notion that America first, or that we should really focus on our own country to the standpoint where we need to be stable before we do anything else, is that now that would be, if you said something like that, you would be considered what? Un-American. You see, because the thought pattern today that comes with saying that somebody who was an isolationist or an America first person, that you were un-American, they would be thinking in Hamiltonian terms, which they are. You see, nothing has changed. So Monroe bears the legacy, his most famous legacy of, you know, from the standpoint of something that his name is stamped on, right? And that is the Monroe Doctrine. And it changes everything. But, you know, and it's, you know, Monroe Doctrine gets used as all kinds of an excuse. Monroe Doctrine plus the thing called manifest destiny leads us to the kind of narcissistic arrogance, all right, there I said it, where we just were like, well, just get out of our way. Here we are, you know, and I'm sorry, you know, whatever, you were here first, but, you know, get the hell out of here. You know, we're here now. Here's our laws, here's our stuff, you know, and that's all there is to it. And, you know, so that's part of what we're going to be talking about as far as our legacy is concerned, obviously, with all of this. And, you know, and this is at the forefront of current events as anything possibly could be, you know. So, I mean, I'm in a situation where I was just on taking one of my programs that I have to do to keep my licensure up and everything. And, you know, the course begins with, well, we're here to talk about, you know, whatever psychological subject it is, right? And, but first we want to acknowledge that we're on native Pequot land, you know, see what I mean? So, you know, these things are, this goes directly back to what we're talking about, you know, how this, you know, where we are on the hump of this, you know. And the Monroe Doctrine is what, the Monroe Doctrine is literally what justifies Theodore Roosevelt to, you know, basically, I don't want to use the word steal, but for want of a better term, the Isthmus of Panama, and do whatever we have to do to literally steal Panama from Colombia. And then we build our own, we build, obviously, the Panama Canal. And that changes the course of history. And it changes the course of history and puts the United States in this massive geopolitical advantage as far as military strength is concerned that nobody's ever seen before. I mean, you've got the Suez Canal, that was one thing. But, you know, these are all the things that add up to American history in the late 19th century and early 20th century, right? And but the Monroe Doctrine is a very, very, very big part of all of this. And then later on, that literally gets turbocharged by the Darwinian revolution, right? Which says that, the survival of the fittest, right? So in other words, it now has become normalized that, or scientific, that, well, one side is designed to win according to nature, and the other side is designed to be vanquished according to nature. So now you have God's imprimatur over the notion that, well, I'm sorry I had to kill you, old boy, but I want the girl. And so now, because of Darwinianism, we have basically said that, well, that's the way nature made it. In other words, that's the way God made it. So, I mean, how can you argue with that? That gets abused into something called social Darwinism, which leads us directly to eugenics and like things like the Holocaust. You see? So you're going to be ready for a shot of bourbon when I'm done with you today. Monroe was the first to authorize the building of a permanent military, right? I mean, Jefferson didn't want to do that. Jefferson built a handful of ships, because we had to deal with the Barbary pirates and things like that to protect American shipping. And that's how we wound up with the famous 6 frigates from, what was the guy's name? Joshua Humphreys, right? And including the USS Constitution. It was a good thing we had those ships around for the War of 1812, or, because that was really the only bright spot we had, because pretty much everywhere else we got our butts kicked, except for Andrew Jackson. Right. Monroe's presidency came at a time of transition. The opposing Federalist Party was collapsing, as I told you, right? So, there wasn't the constant mud throwing that you would normally see, that we see today, okay? That we saw during Lincoln's time, that we saw during Jefferson's time. I told you about the era of good feelings and why. Now, to come to the end of this, because we got, believe it or not, an hour and a half has gone by. It's amazing, isn't it? And all of this is at the very beginning of what is now going to have to be dealt with regarding the original compromises in not only the Declaration of Independence, but especially the Constitution, right? The Declaration of Independence is an inspirational document, it's an ideological document. The Constitution is the basis of our law, right? And the basis of our law was originally written in what was like the 3/5 slave clause and all the rest of that. Obviously, you can't say that it didn't promote slavery, right? So the idea here is that we have to deal with this. I mean, it came a point by the time that Monroe was around where this was no longer a can that could be further kicked down the road. Okay, so it was during Monroe's tenure where like the beginnings of the rumblings and the controversy and the flat out fight led directly to the Civil War. It didn't happen during Monroe's time, but it was where the rumblings of it were like, what are we going to do here? Okay. And, this was a period of time where the Missouri Compromise was enacted, which was, kind of like a half measure to, once again, I just use that term, kick the can down the road. This wasn't going to solve it. You were going to have Missouri, and I think it was the lower boundary of Missouri. You were going to draw a line across and say, well, everything above here is going to be free, but this really, really got compounded very badly after Monroe's time, because you had, the Spanish, not the Spanish-American War, but the Mexican-American War, which opened up this vast region, which was practically as big as the Louisiana Purchase. And it was kind of like the southern states knew that they were going to be surrounded politically in Washington if they didn't keep an equal representation of slave-holding state representation in Congress, that they were going to be a diminishing quantity. And that's what created the urgency here as the country was getting bigger. And these tensions, the Missouri Compromise, the addition of Kansas, all the rest of these things, which happened, you know, right after Monroe, these were the things that led directly to the bifurcation of our country. And it's kind of like, it's got to be this, or it's going to have to be that. Or as Lincoln famously stated, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Monroe's favorite solution to slavery, you know what his position was? His position was the gradual emancipation of slaves, and then you repatriate them back to Africa. That's what Monroe's position was. We send them back to Africa, but we're not going to be mean about it, right? We're not going to drop you off in a ship. So the United States under Monroe, right? The American Colonization Society and the Monroe administration began providing federal grants to purchase what is now called Liberia, right? And that's where these repatriated former slaves were going to go. And the capital of Liberia is called Monrovia, named famously after our own James Monroe. So there's another thing that's named after President Monroe, not just the town of Monroe. Well, there's my introduction for you. I will see you soon, right? And that's going to be on April 5th. And I look forward to seeing you then. If you have any questions, bring them up if you want to, or.
Yes, does anyone have any questions for Art before we end the session?
Okay, it's
If
my,
not-
huh?
No,
Yeah.
if not, then that's okay.
I think we're good.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Art, for your time. The next session, as Art said, will be Wednesday, April 5th at 2 p.m. I will send out the Zoom link about a week or so before ahead of time. This will be recorded as well and put on YouTube, hopefully by tomorrow, but if not, by next week. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you all very soon.
Very good, but whatever happened to Liberia? The U.S. give it up?
Well, they'll have to hire me to do another presentation to tell you that. Okay.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
Thank
All
you.
right, everyone, goodbye.
Bye.